Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Gray Matter. I'm your host, Leighton Gray. Today, again, we're blessed to have a very intriguing guest, a man who I would call my friend, and a man of a very eclectic and varied background, deeply academic in one sense, but in others, not so much, very connected to the common people. And he's also going to talk about his burgeoning career as a documentary filmmaker. His name is Dr. Peter Sacco. So, as we always do, we're going to frame our discussion a little bit in terms of our guest and have a few quotations. In honor of our guest, who's got a very eminent background in psychology, I've got a quotation from Dr. Jordan Peterson, who might be, in my opinion, is the most important public intellectual in Canada, even though nobody talks about him. I think his last two books, 12 Rules for Life and Antidote to Chaos and Beyond Order, should be required reading for every high school student in Canada. But sadly, Dr. Peterson is ignored by the Canadian public and in some areas abhorred, which is sad, but is a sign of the times. Anyway, Dr. Peterson said, in order to be able to think, you have to risk being offensive. And that is part of the point of what we're going to be talking about with Peter Sacco today, in particular in terms of his now award-winning documentary called Lockstep. Also, in honor of our guest, who's a psychologist, one of the giants of psychology, certainly modern psychology, and one who Dr. Peterson admires very much is Carl Jung, who famously said, "People will do anything, no matter how absurd, in order to avoid facing their own souls. One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." And again, this is part of the point, I think, of Peter's film. So who is Peter Sacco? Well, Peter Sacco is a teacher of psychology. He's a member of the Ontario Association of Counselors, Consultants, and Psychometrists and Psychotherapists, as well as the Canadian Mental Health Association. Peter holds a BA in Psychology from Brock University, an MA in Counseling from Niagara University, an MA in Theology from the Southern California Graduate School in Theology, and a PhD in Developmental Psychology from American Pacific University. And he's been teaching for over 20 years in addiction studies, and as a professor of mental health issues as well as addictions. He says in his bio, "I'm current on the best methods that work to treat bad habits, addictions, and mental health issues. I train with the creators of modern clinical hypnotherapy and one of the fathers of cognitive therapy, Dr. Albert Ellis, to bring excellent approaches for quick and effective healing. I'm now offering one-on-one counseling sessions, coaching through Zoom sessions to meet your needs and make myself more accessible around the clock or in person." It says that he's cut down his active practice in order to focus on some of his other interests, one of which is filmmaking. He's been a professor for 26 years, a therapist off and on during that time. He's helped and worked with folks from all walks of life. And today in 2022, coming out of lockdowns, many folks are hurting, even staggering. He says, "I feel your pain as I know what it feels like," as he is a survivor of PTSD himself. He says, "I'm here to help you become the best version of yourself and always strive to leave clients better off than they were before we met." Wow. Peter, are you satisfied with your introduction, or have I blown you up out of the stratosphere? Welcome to Gray Matter. Thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you so much, Leighton. It's been great getting to know you and what you stand for. And I literally lost track over the last 10 years of what my background really is. And you carry things forward. I believe whoever you've worked with or you've done anything with in the past, you take it forward, and they leave their imprint in you. And I think you impart that onto the folks that you kind of come across. And you mentioned the one name, Dr. Albert Ellis. I've got to say, he was very profound in my life. He is one of the fathers. He's the father of rational emotive behavioral therapy. He was basically to cognitive psychology what Freud was to psychoanalysis. And I had the great fortunes of not only learning from him, but also having him as a mentor to counsel in front of him, which was amazing in itself. And other people like Dr. Lazarus, and getting to know Bill Glasser, Dr. William Glasser, the creator of reality therapy. I've been able to apply this to my career and even evaluate sort of what's going on in the world today from a cognitive perspective.
Mm-hmm. Well, one of the things don't forget to tell you about, because you're involved in hypnotherapy. Don't forget me to get me to tell you about the time I represented Michael Jackson. I'll come back to that. Bit of a teaser that has a connection to hypnotherapy and mesmerism. Anyway, Peter, I know you are becoming a person who's more and more in the public consciousness, particularly in Canada, because of the success of Lockstep, this documentary film that you just made. But I wonder if you wouldn't mind telling us a little bit more about your background. I know you're from Ontario, you grew up in Ontario, and obviously with your educational background, you developed an interest in psychology. But can you tell us a little bit more about yourself? You know, growing up, what drew you to psychology and helping people with things like addictions and trauma?
That's a really interesting question, Leighton, that I can kind of go in a thousand directions with it. But I think a lot of it, to a degree, people used to say, well, the reason a lot of people get into psychology is because they go in to try to, help other people because they really want to. That's the noble answer that a lot of folks will give. And the other side of the coin is it's like a double-edged sword, as people go in to try to figure themselves out, so to speak. And I think certain individuals go into careers because they've had life experiences or there's reflections of the persona that draw them. So in psychology, we use a term, looking glass self, where when I look at those closest to me, those that I hang around with, I see myself in them. They reflect back to me the way I see myself or the way I want them to see me. And I think, getting into psychology, I believe we're all psychologists to certain degrees, that we all try to understand ourselves better, and we try to empathize with humanity, those closest to us. And I think as a youngster, as somebody young, who himself had been bullied as a kid, I think everybody at some point's been bullied in their lives, but I remember when I was really young getting bullied by guys that were like 2-3 years older than me and a lot bigger. And I remember taking it and not understanding why it was happening. And I didn't dare fight back because I remember my father saying, you get in trouble at school or you do whatever, you're going to get it twice as bad when you get home. And the whole time this was going on, I had already been in martial arts since the time I was 7. And this is by the time I'm like 9.5, this has been going on. So I literally could have hurt these people very, very bad. But I chose to, I took it because I was afraid of shaming my parents or getting in trouble or making my parents or even make myself look bad at school. And I knew what it was like to be a victim of abuse, because that's exactly what it was. I know exactly, when people go, well, do you understand what racial abuse is or whatever? And I could say, yeah, I absolutely know what it is. My grandparents came over from Italy. My grandfather was a pig farmer and a bricklayer. They got nothing from our government. And growing up, I would hear stories, and even names that I was called for being an Italian. There's derogatory names. And I knew exactly what that felt like. People think it's all about the color of your skin, but it's not always about the color of your skin. Sometimes it's when your name ends in a certain vowel, your last name.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember as a kid being told that by a mentor of mine who has since passed on. And this person was an amazing member of the community. And he once said it. He goes, Peter, don't ever take it personally. It's not about you. Sometimes it's just about where you came from.
Mm-hmm.
So when I put this all together, Leighton, in fact, I wanted to be a lawyer at first. That's what I went to university for, ironically. But as I was taking philosophy courses, um, economics courses, political science, and psychology, the one that was sticking the most with me and held the most was psychology, because I was absolutely being forced to not only learn material out of a textbook, listen to professors speak, but also have to do soul searching to figure out who the heck is Pete. What and who am I, based on how I got to that point in my life, because there was a lot of changes. In fact, when I was a lot younger, I thought, hey, maybe one day I want to play pro hockey. I'd like to play pro hockey. When I was younger, I was pretty good at hockey, pretty good at baseball, but I never took it serious enough. I had injuries. And then when by the time you're hitting puberty, you're becoming a teenager, you're starting to drift into other things, other interests. And that's where I went. So there was a lot of figuring out who the heck I was, especially after nearly failing out of first year university, because I was terrible at calculus, terrible at economics, but the psychology part stuck. And then I went from wanting to be a criminal attorney to basically becoming, a psychology lover, and then really focusing and specializing on criminal psychology, addiction psychology, and relationships.
Mm-hmm. Fascinating. What you talk about in terms of growing up, being part of a certain ethnicity, I think is largely forgotten. It's not so long ago. I can tell you, for example, my father, who is the First Nations on one side and German on the other, he said, when I went to school, I didn't know what to tell people because, of course, Germans and Italians, growing up in the 1950s, a lot of people didn't like Germans and Italians because, we just finished a war with them. And also, people, sometimes people just don't appreciate or respect people who are from a different culture. They're from somewhere else, right? And that is the thing, in my view, that makes Canada great. That's what made the West great, is that we were able to bring all of these different cultures together, people from different cultures together, and in our best representation of ourselves nationally. Speaking of Canada, um, it was borrowing from the best of all these different cultures. And so when I hear terms like cultural appropriation now, I'm going, what are you talking about? I mean, that's exactly what we do. That's what we do with cultures. There's so much about the Italian culture that is wonderful. I was just speaking with Christine Anderson, who you might know as the lady who sort of tore our prime minister a new one in the European Parliament. And she was talking about the great guilt complex that the German people have, even today, over the Nazi period. So that's very fascinating that you would share that. Obviously, the viewers already realize how open you are, uh, and I think they're going to find out how fascinating you are as we get on in this conversation. So, Peter, next question, and we're going to get to Lockstep, but I just want to ask you a couple other things, if you don't mind. You've had a lifetime of study in psychology, which you've talked about. What has that taught you about human nature?
That it's a hypocrisy, Leighton. that, that although humans are very predictable, they're also the most unpredictable, where it's a conundrum, or those that you believe that you can predict human behavior for, that you would expect them to behave a certain way, is not. It's, a lot of times the opposite will happen, and vice versa. So one of the things that psychology has taught me the most is to never have expectations of other individuals, because you will always be disappointed. Whereas you should be hopeful that individuals will be a certain way, but don't expect, because sometimes our own expectations are so high that we force others to try to live up to those expectations, and it's not fair to them either. So
Mm.
what I've learned is to just live and let folks just be their own selves. And ideally, you would hope that they would be the best version of themselves. And if they're not, to accept them where they are at that given point in their life, because they're doing the best with what they have, and that's just who they are.
Mm-hmm. So, getting into the context though of say addictions, how would that apply? I mean, for example, if someone you cared about very deeply were in the grips of alcoholism or drug abuse or some other type of addiction, how would you be able to navigate that in terms of accepting them for who they are and not sort of imposing your expectations on them? How would you navigate that?
I think and believe you have to separate the person from the habit or addiction that they have. That's first and foremost. That the addiction themselves should not define that person for who and what they really are. And that, there'll be folks out there that'll argue this. And I totally get it, because I myself have been invited to AA meetings and A meetings, which I'm not a sponsor, but for some reason I got invited by folks that were getting their medallions that evening, and they said, "Would you please come, because you've been an influence in my life." So I've been in them, and you'll hear folks that say, "Hi, I'm Joe. I'm an alcoholic," or "I'm Sue, and I'm I'm a heroin addict," or whatever it is. And it was that one where I sat there, and I was listening, thinking, okay, I'm not going to judge this. If it's working for them, they're working the 12-step program, and they're able to identify with that specific addiction and call themselves it. And if it's working, then don't mess with it. Because I had this assertive argument with somebody about this once before that was on the opposite side. This fellow has passed away since. He was a mentor to me. I did lunch with this guy almost every day. We'd go for pho at the Vietnamese restaurant. His wife at the time was one of my bosses as a university president. And him and I were the best of friends. He was a fair bit older than me. And at the time he died suddenly of a heart attack. He was Canada's, how did he put it, oldest alcoholic in recovery. He had been in AA in Canada the longest, more than anybody else.
Wow.
And he was a testament. And I remember what he used to tell me. He was an alcoholic when he was 14. He was clean and sober by the time he was 18. That was after he gave up drinking alcohol. And at the time in Winnipeg, they had what were called coffee houses. So as he put it, as are his words, all of us drunks used to sit together in these coffee houses, monitoring each other all day and all night, making sure nobody would touch a drop of alcohol. Therefore, we went from drinking alcohol to, at one point, he says he was up to 45 cups of coffee a day. So I said, "Oh, great. You're just going from one addiction to the next." And I remember we would be talking about this, but I remember him saying, he goes, "I don't consider myself an alcoholic, even though I worked the 12-step group, because who I was at 14 and then changing at 18." And I remember him saying that who he is at that time, he would have been in his mid to late 70s. He says, "I'm a different person. I'm not that same guy. Therefore, I will not identify with the disease, because I am not the disease and I don't want to be the disease. And I'm giving the disease power." Whereas some will say, "Well, I'm an alcoholic or I'm this." And I totally get it. I believe it's what works best for that individual, and not to judge. But at the end of the day, I believe you still, and I know even they believe it, because I've been around enough individuals with alcoholism or drug problems, even gambling, porn addictions, that they will say, at the end of the day, I can separate myself, even in the full-blown usage, to say that I'm not at the time inebriated, intoxicated, dependent upon this at that given moment, that I'm clearly able to think in that one moment that maybe I should stop this I love somebody, or I need to go buy booze or drugs, which in that moment tells them that they're separate, if that makes sense,
Mm-hmm.
from the vice in that moment, which then lends to credibility that they still have this freedom to choose and a
Mm-hmm.
responsibility to act on that freedom or not act on that freedom, which then is the premise for helping that individual overcome that vice or that addiction.
I
Sorry
think
about the long-winded. It's
no. In
very deep.
fact, I'm very grateful for that because you just answered a question that has really troubled me for a long time, and that is that I've always wondered about the phenomenon of the, let's say, the highly functioning alcoholic. For example, there was a very fascinating miniseries that was on some years ago called Mad Men, and the main character was this ad man who actually was an alcoholic, but for most of in many parts of his life, he was highly functional. He was extremely successful in business. He was able to maintain a marriage and a family for a period of time. That breaks down, but this phenomenon of the high functioning alcoholic is something that I've always wondered about. And I think you've kind of explained it. There's that little space between themselves and their addiction that they can navigate to kind of get through life. It sounds like your friend, in his own right, was a very successful academic. And so obviously this can be done, but I've always wondered, how does a person, drink that much but still get through their days? So Peter, I want to talk to you about obviously the COVID-19 pandemic because you're an expert. Let's face it, you're an expert in psychology, and so we want to mine some of the best ideas you have. You and I were talking just before we came on camera about something that Theo Fleury said in this program. And when I asked Theo Fleury, obviously a very successful ex-hockey player, I asked Theo, Theo, you could be living life very comfortably. You had a very successful sports career. You've got other things going on, other business interests. Why are you so outspoken? Why are you so much in social media and why are you so involved and concerned about what's going on in the Canadian public and the Canadian public psyche? And he said, "Well, I'm triggered." And he said he's triggered because, of course, he was very open about a book that he published about 12, 13 years ago about the fact that he was the victim of sexual abuse as a teenager and how that led to a lot of the problems that we were just discussing, alcoholism, drug addiction, and so on. And he says he's triggered because what he's seeing today is our governments, especially the federal government, really perpetrating these same abusive tactics, the same ones that were carried out against him when he was a teenager. And so, would you pick up on that? Maybe explain the sort of psychological warfare tactics being employed on us by our governments, the media, experts, during the COVID-19 pandemic?
When you look at that, Leighton, and I'm really trying to use the razor's edge here. I'm trying to separate myself from my professionalism because many moons ago, I was consulting for organizations connected, let's just say at the federal government level, where I was teaching them and law enforcement tactics that cults use, even terrorist organizations use, to manipulate and control an audience. Would I say that the government is a terrorist organization? No. The reason I won't say that is because, first of all, I love my country. I would hope that our government wouldn't do that, and there's good people that make up the government so that they wouldn't do that. Has the media done stuff that is similar to it, meaning the brainwashing components of it? I believe so. Where this repetitive nature, and it's not to say that it's terrorism, but they're very similar to repetition over and over and over, where you're getting people to actually say things over without even thinking through them. So if you were to look at concepts, and where do these concepts come from? And I asked this to this very day, and I can't get an answer. Give us 2 weeks or whatever the heck it was to flatten the curve. Has the curve ever been flattened? I have not seen anything on this. And what is the curve actually? What is this? What is the science or the mathematics behind this curve? Because as an instructor, as an educator, I got to validate what I present to a class, or when I've done my papers to the Canadian Psychological Association, or even to any organizations that I make a statement. I've got to validate it, which means, does it measure what it is intended to measure? And also, is it reliable? That can I test this, and can I get the same results or similar ones with repetitive testing or whatever? I have never seen that. And that's a concern when a media is putting it out. And then I see ads from the government that's putting out what the media is saying, or the two are intertwined. So all things aside, let's just say I'm still okay with that. But one of the things I need to see are all perspectives on something. Because as they say, there's 3 sides to every story. There's one person's side, the other person's side, and then the truth in the middle. That would fall somewhere in the middle. But all I've been basically seeing for the most part is a one-dimensional side with pushback from another side. Yet I've never seen that gray middle ground where there's answers that are quantified and qualified, I guess is the best way of putting it from a psychological perspective when it comes to testing. So going back to the example I gave of the government side when I was teaching officials with cults and terrorist stuff and teaching them signs to look for, you get asked a question, can you test for that? And a lot of the times the answer is you can't control, you can test for it. There was a famous study done where they put individuals acting, and it was, I believe, in Sweden, a great study where they took actors and they put them in a prison. So half were to play guards and half were to play prisoners. By the time this study was done, the prisoners really took beatings from the guards because the guards had taken this so serious, and they created and changed the gambit of human nature by having folks play different roles. And you see this in conformity, especially with gangs. You get mild-mannered individuals that have been rejected from society, especially teenagers that have low self-esteem, suffer from identity confusion or no identity. They get taken into a group and they get molded into a whole new being, or a whole new persona. And with that said, you can see it. I always believe in the eye test. You can see people behaving and doing a certain way.
Hmm.
And having said that, to go back to the whole COVID, the COVID idea and the whole idea of abuse, I don't understand what a lockdown ever entailed. Now that we're seeing all these studies that show that lockdowns are not good. In fact, you have health organizations that said it was horrible. In fact, it's horrible for kids. And I can speak to this as a counselor because I've had parents contact me saying, is it normal for a 7-year-old kid to want to commit suicide because they've been locked up in their house for 6 months, not able to see their kids or other kid friends, other individuals that can't fathom how is it possible that one type of business is non-essential, even though you go and buy food there all the time, or you need to go buy a pair of underwear, which are no longer essential. And last time I thought underwear were pretty darn essential. But yet a whole time you've got liquor stores that are open. And I was hearing the argument at the time where folks were going, well, it's because it's helping those that have the alcoholics. And I was sitting there thinking, this still doesn't make sense, because if you're helping an alcoholic, then why don't you have curbside pickup and they pick the alcohol of their choice? Because most alcoholics pick a certain type of drink and they're climatized and addicted to that certain. But No, you didn't have that. You had individuals walking around liquor stores shopping, which I'm looking at this going, wow. And same with cannabis stores. And ironically, let's go back to the future. We'll go in our DeLorean right now, flux capacitor. We go back 30 years ago, there was individuals incarcerated and put in jail because they used hash or marijuana. It wasn't an essential drug back then. Let's go back 100 years, prohibition. Alcohol was not an essential supply. It was in fact illegal. You can just Google, if anybody doesn't believe me, go look up Al Capone and the whole bootlegging things and Bugsy Siegel. But in those time periods, food was always essential. So was clothing. If you go to Maslow's hierarchy of needs, it's basically the simple things of life: food, water, shelter, clothing. So how can you remove some but not the others? And how can you tell certain individuals that their livelihood is not important to somebody else's and totally cut that freedom away? Who makes that decision? Especially when you voted those people in, you should have, there could have been some sort of say into it. So to answer your original question, some individuals, especially if they had been in abusive relationships in the past, whether as a child, as a battered spouse, male or female, being forced into a lockdown for them could have very much been considering almost like they were being terrorized and forced into something that they did not want to be in because they believed that their freedoms were violated, their ability to express themselves were violated, and their ability to go and seek the proper information from all three sides, each side plus the middle ground, to find out what the truth was. And so some people were feeling, I believe, abused in the sense that they were never allowed to express themselves, to act on their own best interests, and that they were being told what to do and how to do it. And in fact, in a lot of households, and I can't even begin to imagine this. This is going to be staggering. I really do believe truths are going to get out. I've heard some of them myself already. I've heard them through colleagues. The amount of childhood sexual assaults and sexual abuse that have gone on in households during that lockdown, it's got to be off of the charts. I know, having worked with victims of abuse in the past, their solace is to go to school every day and get away from the perpetrator, to go to an organized sporting event, to go over to their friend's house, just to get out of that house. These kids were locked into a place where they were terrorized by their perpetrators. It goes on, for the most part, it's been going on in their lives, but in some situations, I believe the situations were exacerbated. I believe they were a lot worse than they were before. I believe opportunities were presented to perpetrators. And I believe it went to the amount of mental health issues and disorders that individuals are suffering to this moment that are coming out because of the being locked in a house, having their job taken from them, having their livelihoods taken from them. Individuals that were never addicts or had issues now have issues. I can only imagine, and this is going to be an interesting, if anybody wants to get into a really neat study to look at, I would love to know what the incidence of gambling addiction and problematic gambling online is now since these lockdowns. People go, oh, I heard Leighton, somebody say, well, at least it's keeping gamblers out of the casino. It's like, well, have a look at commercials. If you're watching any of the NHL hockey playoffs, I'm seeing all these commercials for Bet and all these other ones. And I just really do believe there's a lot of individuals who have had their lives either turned upside down or have had them ripped from them. And for the individual that felt that they were in an abusive relationship in the past, that felt trapped, I believe that this has recapitulated it for some individuals that felt that they develop, when we see it in battered person syndrome, battered spouse syndrome, battered woman syndrome, battered man syndrome, we see this sense of hopelessness, helplessness, and haplessness. We're seeing all of these symptoms now, the residuals of 2 years of off and on lockdowns, where there's this, you do this, you do this, you do this, then you can go free again. You can go free again. So the person then feels, oh my gosh, I'm free, I'm free, I'm free. Oh no, you're going to have another lockdown. So basically, I'm not going to say this as a psychologist. I'm not going to say it as a scientist because I can't qualify it and I can't quantify it. But what this sure as heck looks like is almost like manic depression or bipolar. We're up, down, up, down, up, down. And it's almost like playing with people's emotions where they're so discombobulated, disjointed with their emotions, they don't know who they are and what they feel anymore.
Mm-hmm. Well, I've heard, and I wonder if you'd agree with this. I've read, I believe this is Freud and Jung, but many psychologists have said that basically we're all walking around with different sets of psychological issues, and some of us are more quote unquote well adjusted than others. But it's safe to say that whatever was being done to us during the pandemic was making our particular psychological issues worse, right? So well-adjusted people might be turning to drugs and alcohol, or might begin to suffer from depression, and those people who had suffered previous trauma would suffer more as a result. Would you think that that's a fair assessment?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I It's unfortunate, and this is almost like a, how should I even put it? It's almost like a hypocrisy. There were so many individuals, and I say this respectfully, that were never in touch with their emotions. They were just kind of going through life before the last 2 years came. And then you had a lot of folks that were forced to get in touch with their emotions because their emotions started bubbling up.
Mm-hmm.
There was the breakdown of the family. There was the breakdown of their own mental health. Then I believe those that already, a lot of them that had mental health issues that were struggling with anxiety, depression, um, this made it worse. I have no
Mm-hmm.
doubt about it. I believe that there was folks that never knew what a mental health disorder was, Leighton, that now know what a mental health disorder is up close and personal because they have it.
Mm-hmm.
And I believe that if they don't have it, there's a lot of parents that know what it is now through their children. That you mentioned my own fact with PTSD. This recreated it for myself in many ways, that I was not able to go and do what I used to do. Especially, you can't go to the gym, you can't do this, you can't do that, and especially in the darkest months of winter. Um, in my house, I felt trapped.
Mm-hmm.
I see a homeopath. I'm very happy to have a homeopath because I was, uh, you know, going the drug route before for this, and I didn't like the side effects for it because I've had, insomnia in the past. It's a horrible feeling. And when, people go, oh, yeah, you don't sleep for a few nights or maybe a week or whatever. No, try a few months, 4 to 6 months. It's a horrible, you know, you get to this point where during the day, you can't wait for night to come. And then at nighttime, you can't wait for day to come. It's like this
Wow.
hypocrisy, this conundrum.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm sitting there thinking about it. And if I consider myself pretty level headed and I've got the tools to try to kind of figure things out and cope with it. But there was a lot of folks that don't have these tools. They don't have the support systems. And I'm blessed to have a wonderful woman in my life that supports me, my parents, my family, friends that they check in on you, and vice versa. We check in on each other. But the problem is that when you're in an enmeshed situation where there's history of violence, history of that kind of stuff, it's not a very good situation, because the people that you're connected to are your sources of support that sometimes are doing the violence or doing the assaults or whatever it is, the emotional abuse even. And the problem is with this, a lot of folks who wanted to reach out for support systems, the government took them away.
Mm-hmm.
The government took mental health away, mental health support away. You couldn't go because it's too dangerous. You try to do this online, and then it's hard to get in because there's no jobs there. People have lost their jobs or whatever. Same thing. I remember at the beginning of this whole COVID thing, I believe I had it right at the beginning of it. I remember back in 2009, I think it was, I got H1N1. My aunt, who I was very, very, very close to, was dying in the hospital, and she was a Nona to me. She was as close to my mom. So I was at the hospital 3 times a day, and H1N1 broke out, and you could only go into the hospital through the emergency. And at that time they were saying, well, you shouldn't come in there unless, it's an emergency. They didn't want people to get sick with it. And I remember, I'm not going to miss this, because at any day my Nona could have went. She could have died. And I went there, and I remember I had to go through emergency, and I wound up getting H1N1. I was run down. I was tired. And I remember how it felt like. It was a horrible feeling. I had never had anything like that, where it felt like somebody was sitting on my chest. I couldn't breathe. My head was being squeezed like it was in a vice. And right at the beginning of COVID-19, or whatever you want to call it, I had pretty much the same symptoms. I remember going downstairs and trying to walk up my stairs, Leighton. I was winded. I thought, are you kidding me? What the heck's going on? And I remember at that time, if you try to go and get help, or even go to a walk-in clinic, they wouldn't want to see you.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, stay home, stay safe, don't spread the virus, or don't spread it. You know what I mean? So there was a lot of mixed messages. And I believe that confused a lot of folks with this whole process, because it sure as heck confused me on what we're doing here. At the beginning, we were all in this together. And then last year, whatever your medical choice was, you're not all in this together. So which one is it? Are we unifying each other, or are we disunifying each other? So to go to Theo's point, you had government officials that were calling out certain sectors of a population because they wanted to exercise their medical choice by calling them whatever they were, not being good members of society, being different, whatever the term was. And I don't even remember, because I blocked it out, because it
fringe minority, racist, misogynist. Yeah.
Terms like that.
Yeah.
And I'll be honest with you, Leighton. I had to tune those out, because they affected me personally. Going back to mentioning what I went through as a kid, I'm hearing those. And in fact, to have a teacher once call me that, because I'm half French, half Italian. So last name as the Italian name. And then when I went to the other side, you're this French type person, and they had names for that. So I'm sitting there listening, just going, this is like, is there something off here? Because if I recall, a year before, everybody was celebrating the unfortunate incidents of George Floyd as a chance to bring society together and embrace our cultural diversities and differences, and all stand together and be one, and recognize that we are all created in the image of God. All men are created equal. All men and women are created equal. So that was the message I got in a year before, in 2020 it was. And then all of a sudden, 2021, it's the opposite message. Well, how is that possible? I don't understand it. But the sad part was, it's the government that's putting that message out, or members connected to the government. Like I'll say it again, I don't believe everybody is that way. I believe there's a lot of folks that, the majority of them, you would hope, that are doing their jobs and representing the best interests of the people. who voted them in there and that are representing the Canadian Constitution, the Charter of Rights, and common law for what we should all be practicing, because that's not only the law, but it's also common sense. And so I could see how some folks felt terrorized because they were basically being singled out as the bad people for not going along with a narrative that was being kind of discussed. And I believe some of these folks would have went possibly along with the narrative if they just would have been shown the evidence or some sort of scientific backing of this that showed reliability, validity, the way we've always done it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I believe it created more confusion than ever before, where folks, especially those that had or have mental health issues, kind of thought, what the heck just happened? Why is there a certain day of the year put out by a big company that says it's a mental health awareness day, if you know what I mean? Mental health issues are so important, but why didn't they matter as much for lockdowns?
Right. So all of which, and that's a great prelude to Lockstep. But all of that sort of begs the question, and that is this by design? So let's segue into your documentary, and I want to start off with a clip. This is your own introduction to the documentary. If you could play that, please, Devin.
I wanted to say a few words about this film before you get a chance to see it. First of all, everybody that has appeared in this film did so of their own choice, voluntarily, and because they believed in freedoms. They're brave individuals who possess integrity and believe in doing and standing up for what is right. This project took about 10 months to complete, 6 months to edit. Nobody was paid for doing any of this. It was all done voluntarily, zero budget. And it was brought forward to let people express their voices, people to share their worries, their concerns, their anxieties, individuals who have suffered atrocities, including war crimes, assaults, bullying, you name it. These folks wanted to share their stories. This film was for voices that need to be heard, truths that need to be told, and understanding what potentially is really going on around the world today.
So, Peter, there you sort of give us the impetus for making the documentary. I wonder if you could tell us, though, what the process was like for you of making the documentary. I know that although you have some experience in the arts and with making documentary films, this is a bit of a new avenue for you, though. What was it that caused you to put your ideas into this format? And could you describe sort of what the process was like and what you discovered along the way while you were making Lockstep?
I was being asked a lot at the time. It's kind of funny. People come to you and ask you, what do you think's going on in the world? This doesn't make sense. Do you think there's something more going on in this world? Do you think that people are being manipulated, people are being played, or do you think this is just, like the Spanish influenza all over again? What do you think it is? And you know what, Leighton, I pondered this for a long time. In fact, I had done a documentary, not as long, and it was on the Milgram study, the famous Stanley Milgram study where they shocked students. It was all faked, set up at a university back in the 1960s. And at that time, when I was doing this documentary, Yeah, it was last year. I'm all lost in my years here. So it looked at masks, and I was curious to see how this would be explained using Milgram, especially when you had experts saying they don't work. They do work.
Mhm.
They don't work. They do work. Double mask. No, they don't work. No, they do work. So I decided to kind of look at it from Milgram's perspective to examine why or how folks go along with something, whether it's right or wrong. Okay. I wasn't here to judge it. I just wanted to look at it. So, as a person of science, as a psychologist, I try to do the right thing because it's the right thing to do, which is to look at the evidence, what the research shows, and what you would get in a study. And that's how my mentors brought me up, my former profs, and said, just, if you're going to do something, look at it from all sides. And that's what I wanted to look at first in that Milgram thing. And I had just, for curiosity, I wanted to know, hey, do I have anything here? Can I do a decent documentary of kind of a science source? Because at that time, I was doing a documentary called The Madonna Complex, which looks at pornography addictions in married men. And I did this with two doctors, one in the UK and one in the United States. So at the same time, I was doing that. So they were like two smaller documentaries because I had never done anything big. So I wanted to test drive those, see how I did with them. We put them into film festivals and they did really, really well. They won. The one on the conformity thing was really, really interesting because it was winning. I believe it won on 6 continents, and it was getting film festivals were contacting me saying, we want to see this. This is really, really neat. And once again, I was only taking the science. I was only taking what my forefathers, so to speak, in psychology had done, and I was just extrapolating it into modern times. So I decided I had an individual that a couple of them wanted to see it. So we put it on, I had it put on YouTube, and within 45 minutes, it was banned on YouTube
Wow.
for not being science. And I'm sitting there going, really? This is not science? Because everything that's in this, you can go into any intro psych course at any college or university in North America or Europe, Australia, wherever you have psychology courses, and it's Stanley Milgram, just right to the T.
Mhm.
So I thought, okay, this is interesting. I've never had this before. And it was really interesting because I had shared it on Facebook, which I don't go on anymore since that incident. Because I was getting messages on Facebook, which were absolutely bizarre. But I was on I was in Facebook psychology groups. So we bounce ideas off each other. There's a lot of students on there, professors, psychologists, blah, blah, blah. I had posted on there and people started watching it saying, this is really good. This is really good. And that was right about that time. YouTube had taken it down. And I thought, that is just really odd. So I had, how is it okay in film festivals? But how is it and why is it winning?
Mhm.
So fast forward to Lockstep. It was right at about that time where this event was occurring that folks were going, you think there's more at play? Why don't you do something on it? Because people were giving me experts, different versions of what they thought was going on, how it ties to government. Can the government be controlled? Can the government be manipulated? And absolutely. If anybody doesn't believe that, I don't know, you must have been born yesterday. Let's be realistic, because if it can't be manipulated, we would never have any huge events in the world like scandals, especially
Mhm.
when you got a U.S. president named Richard Nixon that got impeached and had to walk away because of Watergate. So,
Mhm.
yeah, of course there's scandals. You can look at it anywhere. You always see them. In fact, you can look at it right in Canada, where you've had the genocide of Indigenous kids that have been swept under the rug for decades. And it has to come out, Leighton, in movies, of all things on Netflix, for people to really understand what has been going on to that population. So yes, can government cover stuff up? Yes. Are there scandals? Yes. Are governments good? Yeah, governments can be good as well. So I wanted to take an approach. I just wanted to be the moderator, so to speak. So I wanted to kind of consider myself in a roundabout way, like how would we put it? Like a reality TV show. I'm the host, and everybody's competing to survive or do whatever, but they're going to share their perspective. Or the way I put it, maybe I'm a chef. I have an idea for a meal. Folks had given me this idea for a meal, but each of them has different ingredients, and they've asked me to put it all together. And that's what I did with Lockstep. I wanted to show how a government can be changed, manipulated. Folks can be, how should I put this? Manipulated, controlled, encouraged, educated. Once again, I'm going to take all sides of it, both positive and negative, because there's always positive and there's always negative in any situation, depending on your perception of it. So you can have an actual fact, or you can have a truth, but truths aren't always real because that's your perception of how something happened. And people's perceptions of something can be very different. So I wanted to take individuals and folks of all expertises of life to have their opinions, expertise, and knowledge shared on what their perception of Lockstep is and how they believe individuals, not only in North America, but around the world, have potentially been influenced by outside sources. And there was 2 individuals that this was really based around. Because how this started out, I was really interested in the art of war. And the art of war basically looks at how you can influence and take over a society.
Right.
So here I was talking to Hanshi Stephen Kaufman, who's in the documentary. He's written over 40 books on the art of war. He's considered probably the guru on this planet. He's one of the founders of American martial arts. I believe he's 84 right now. As he and I got talking, the idea came, let's take the art of war and take it to a sociological, psychological, even an ecological perspective to show how things can be influenced or possibly changed. When you put that ingredient together with somebody who spent nearly 4 years in death camps during the Holocaust, and you have Vera in your documentary, you've got the perfect storm in terms of bringing it all together when you put the other experts like yourself who appeared in it, Leighton, to discuss your take on what's going on and what your perception of what is going on currently happening. And that's all I did. I like to consider myself just the maestro of the orchestra, the host of this reality show, or the chef that put all the ingredients together to put this together to try to explain it and make sense of it. So I didn't know what I had because it's actually over 2 hours. And I had never done anything on this magnitude. First of all, I got 0 training in film. I've never taken a course in how to use a camera in my life, never taken a course in how to edit film or anything in my life, or to direct in my life. So I thought, wow. So I'm sitting here thinking with all of you folks, as I'm interviewing you, like, oh my God, I hope I do this pretty good. And when I'm saying, oh my God, I really am saying, I'm saying, Lord God, bless me that I put something out there that is good and not a piece of garbage, because I don't want to, I don't want to offend these folks, especially when one of them is like at the level of Chuck Norris. If this guy decides to come across from New York City, he's going to basically, Mr. Miyagi me, wax on, wax off me like a fly on the windshield. So I'm sitting here thinking, and I kid you not, Leighton, as I was telling you, I go through these bouts of insomnia. I had already had insomnia from some issues that I was having with PTSD and vertigo. And then this was adding to it, sitting there thinking, what the heck do I got here? Because as I was adding all of your stories and all of your insights and expertise, I thought, how the hell am I ever going to put this together? This is all over the place. There's a lot to put together. And it really took me, in essence, 6 months to put this thing together, piece by piece. And I really do believe it was inspired by the grace of God that he walked me through this, because I prayed a lot about this. And first of all, I believe it was never my project. It was his project. I want to believe that he anointed or appointed me to do this, and that all of you folks that came into this were all brought to me, and vice versa, that there was a larger, how should we put this, influence at hand, that this needed to get out, not because I wanted it out there and not because it was mine, because I don't consider this my project. I consider it God's and your project. Everybody that was in this is for everybody to use. And it's just, I was just the one to put it together.
Well, we're going to talk a little bit about how well it's been received. Before we do that, we're going to just show one more clip, if we could, Devin, from Lockstep.
Silently, what has happened is that the Charter of Rights right now, because of the way the judges are interpreting these charter rights, is no longer an effective means of protecting the individual from the oppressive power of the state. Everything that has been done with Indigenous peoples in Canada, and I should state that I am a status Indian myself. I'm descended from Indian chiefs, but my view is really anathema to the accepted view, that everything that the government has done, the government of Canada has done, has been done to subjugate Indigenous peoples and to make them entirely dependent on government. I mean, I could talk at length about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which should be, called the Lies and Conflict Commission, because about 85% of the stories that, for example, that were submitted to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission were actually positive stories about residential schools and not negative ones, but they sifted through and they found all the worst ones about abuse. And then that's what came through in the report. And that this has been a very ripe, ground for people who want to run, critical race theory, for example.
So there's that. Obviously, that was my role. There are many much more interesting people than me in there, but that's an example of what you were able to do, Peter. That is to bring sort of these different people together from different perspectives, all of whom seem to have the same ability, if you like, to question the dominant narrative in different ways. And I love the way you organize the film into these different categories. In my particular area of expertise, I was talking about human rights and Indigenous rights. But of course, the other gentleman you're talking about is an expert in the art of war. He's obviously one of the stars of the film. I was gripped really by some of the ideas that he was relating. But Peter, I want to ask you: have you been surprised by really the overwhelmingly positive response that the film has received? I mean, you must have had a sense that this thing was going to be controversial. Have you been surprised and gratified by all the awards and things that it's garnered so far?
I have been beyond grateful when I get emails saying that this film has just been selected to another film festival, or that it's won awards the way it is. Like, we're talking, this film itself has been selected now to, I believe it's at 20 film festivals. Incredible. Which is also including awards. And to put that in perspective, I put it into film festivals, Leighton, April 21st. So we're talking a month, which is, it's beyond me. When I look at it, like, I've been asked by a lot of folks, what is it about, or how would you consider it? And I view it as a documentary / educational film. Myself, interesting, I don't use the term controversial myself, because I believe everybody is entitled to their opinion. But there's folks that are using real life experience, that have been there, seen it, done it. And they got not only anecdotal information, but they got the actual facts to back it up. So when I look at it from that perspective, I would believe it's 100% educational. I was asked, who was your favorite part of the whole thing? I said, I don't have one favorite person. It's everybody that was in it, because each time I like to look at it, and I hope you don't get offended by this, but you're part of a fruit salad, Leighton. When you shove that spoon in, every spoonful you put out doesn't have the same fruit on it. It's a different mouthful, so to speak. And that's how I like to look at it, because everybody was so different, but in many respects, everybody was so similar, and they were passionate about what they were talking about. And putting this together actually incited emotions within me. To listen to Vera Sharav talk.
Right. Yes.
I was almost in tears when I was doing the interview with her, because there's a lot of stuff that's not in this film that I could have made this easily a 6-hour film. And some of the stuff I couldn't put in because it was so personal, it was so emotional. And when she was telling me about what she went through in death camps and watching people die around her own father, I'll never forget where she said they were throwing their coats away while they were on a boat, because they believed if they had thrown their coats away, they would not be subjugated and go into this internment camp as being ethnic Jews that basically had some sort of status. And I remember her saying that. At the time, she was pushing 4 years old, and she said she watched all these adults in the middle of winter throwing their stuff overboard on this little boat, and her father threw his coat out in these freezing temperatures, but she clung to her teddy bear. She refused to throw it away. And it was only when her dad died at the hands of, because of the Holocaust, she said to this moment she regretted, wondering that if she would have just, why she didn't throw that bear over. It could have made a difference, the way she put it, or she was being selfish for not throwing that out when everybody else made sacrifices. But there she was, a 3.5-year-old holding on to a teddy bear. So to this day, you know, you go back to the 1940s to now, that thought has never left her mind. Listening to your story about the Indigenous, Colin's story about the Indigenous, those really major chords with me. I knew that this had gone on in Canada. I had no idea to that extent. I had no idea that so many folks to this day, there's been no resolution to it. They're still hurting. There's been promises made to folks in various tribes, in various Indigenous organizations, and nothing has really been done. Like, it's all been lip service. And it really upset me, thinking, what the heck's going on here? Like, we should be doing something more. And, you know, anybody who's watching this that's from an Indigenous organization, I'm yours. If you ever need a video done free of charge or whatever you need, I will do whatever I can to support the Indigenous organizations around not only Canada, but the world, because this was our Holocaust year. It was a horrible one. But the problem with this is it was done visibly and invisibly, both ways. And it was done to, how should we put it, the most innocent kids, like being ripped from your own parents, being, you know, what was done was absolutely horrible. And was it? Can you call it lockstep? Yeah, because it went over a period of time and it wasn't being corrected at all. And if you follow Stephen Kaufman, who was talking about the art of war, it was done to their society, to their group, where outsiders came in, infiltrated them, and basically created all of these abuses against them, which is basically subversion. So you had you had the group that was here first in Canada, the truest of true Canadians, that wound up being the least Canadian and not being able to stand up for their own selves or rights because they had them all taken away.
You know, watching Lockstep and listening to you talk about it, Peter, it reminds me of quotation from Sir Francis Bacon, who famously wrote, "We cannot know the light but for the darkness." And I would say that Lockstep is more than educational. I would say that it is motivational and it's inspirational. And what I love about it is that it not only describes things, but it also gives people practical advice and an understanding of what they can do in their lives, in their daily lives, to try and deal with trauma. How do you, for example, the lady you were talking about who lived through the Holocaust and the death camps, well, how do you survive that? What tools do you need to get through that? And that's something that, unfortunately, for those of us in Canada who've lived through the last couple of years, we do need those kinds of tools. So I know we've taken a lot of your time here, Peter, and we're so grateful for it. But I wonder if you could share with us maybe a couple of ideas of the tools, practical tools that people can access to maybe help them get through their own sense of trauma that they're experiencing because of what's described in your movie.
You know what, Leighton, I believe it's going to vary for individual to individual. There is no perfect prescription that's going to work for everybody. I think oftentimes, as I've always been taught, and I believe that God's grace is strongest when we are at our weakest. So for myself, I believe in God. I definitely believe, that He's my higher power, my personal savior. And I believe when you find something or someone that will inspire you, that will lift you up, that will give you strength when you're at your weakest, I believe that's the first part of overcoming. But the hardest part oftentimes is finding a purpose and realizing or still believing that you have some purpose on this planet, some purpose on this earth, some purpose to fulfill, not only for yourself, but to help others. And I think that when we help others, we help ourselves. And I really do believe, from what everybody was telling me in Lockstep, there was a general consensus that you're not aware of, because I got to do all the interviews and I had to whittle a lot of them down because many of them were so very long. But what I found, everybody in there was selfless. They were doing something for somebody else because they really believed in it. And I believe when you put others first, you are, in a roundabout way, it's kind of like an oxymoron. You're putting yourself first in a roundabout way, because, and I'm going to watch how I word this, you're getting satisfaction. You're getting identity, you're getting self-esteem, you're getting some sort of self-concept from helping other people. Even though you are putting others first, whether you realize it or not, you're building yourself up. So really, your selfless acts are inadvertently, in a roundabout way, and we use this term selfish in a way because if I'm helping others, I still have an ulterior motive, which is to make them feel good because it makes me feel good, if that makes any sense.
Oh, it does. It does. It totally does. If people want to watch Lockstep, where would they find it, Peter?
You can only find it on Rumble right now. I had tried to put it up for a film festival for their platform to be rated, and within 2 hours and 15 minutes, YouTube took it down, even though it was put up privately and secretively. Only this festival could see it, or somebody at YouTube that really went out of their way to go look it up or try to find it. And I'm sitting here thinking, wow, I'm sitting here in Niagara on the lake, little old me out in the countryside. YouTube was able to find that, especially when it was put up privately. So it was taken down. So you can only find it on Rumble at this time. And as I says, it's making its rounds through film festivals. And at some point, God willing, when more social platforms open up, which I have a sneaking suspicion, I think they're going to be coming in the not too distant future. I believe changes are going to be coming, really good changes. It'll be available for folks. Or if anybody wants to, you can message me on Facebook and I can send you the link to it.
We're going to provide a link to it here on the show as well. So this is a part of the program where we close off. I know you have to go, Peter, where we try and leave people who are consuming the podcast with some resource, a book or a website or something like that they can access in order to further their understanding, maybe further this discussion that we've just had. I've got a couple on my reading list that I'm going to give, and then I'm going to hand it over to you and let you close out. I know it's going to be difficult for you because you've not only read a lot of books but written some, and one of mine on one of my selections today is one of your books. It's Right Now, Enough is Enough by Peter Andrew Sacco, Making Addictions a Lasting Thing of the Past. So, and it's about overcoming addictions and bad habits for good in 30 days or less. So people wanted to find that book, Peter, where would they find it? Would they find that on Amazon or Barnes and Noble where books are sold, or would they have to look somewhere else?
Yeah, you can find it on Amazon. You can also find it at my website, peterandrewsacco.com. And I believe you can find it through Indigo. It's a resource. It's something I'm very happy to have done, working with individuals with addictions for 20 plus years. At the time I wrote it, I was in that field for roughly 20 years. And I learned a lot. They were my biggest educators, and a lot of the tools that work in overcoming addictions, helping people overcome them, they taught me them. So they know what works. If they can overcome an addiction or work at it, then they know what works. So I just go by what works.
And as we talked about earlier, a lot of those principles would have application to trauma as well, wouldn't they? And so I think even people who are not themselves in the grips of addiction, I would think would still learn a great deal from accessing a book of that nature. One other selection that I've picked out, which is sort of in a different vein, more along the lines of Lockstep, is a book that I read recently by Ben Shapiro. It's called The Authoritarian Moment. And it's about how the left weaponized America's institutions against dissent. And I really see this book, although it's specific to the United States, I think it's applicable to Canada as well, kind of fitting within the theme of Lockstep. The book here is about, it asks the question, how far Americans willing to go to force each other to fall in line, in lockstep, as it were. And here he talks about, totalitarians, both on the left and on the right. And he describes the authoritarian left as now aggressively insisting that everyone must conform to its values, demanding submission and conformity. The dogmatic left is obsessed with putting people in categories and changing human nature. Everyone who opposes it must be destroyed. And so he goes through, he looks at everything from pop culture to the Frankfurt School, social media, to the founding fathers, to explain the origins of the turn to tyranny and why so many people seem blind to it. So I really thought when I read this book recently, when I saw Lockstep, many of the ideas that Ben Shapiro elucidates in that book, I really saw those themes sort of brought out vividly in your documentary. So that's why I mentioned that particular selection. So, Peter, do you have a couple of one, maybe two reading selections, maybe one of your own books or another one that you think would help people in their understanding of some of the topics that you've been talking about with us today?
Well, it's kind of related. It's kind of very different. I love, and I always have, The Power of Positive Thinking by Norman Vincent Peale.
Oh, what a great book. Yeah.
And I believe it is definitely a powerful book. It has stood the test of time. It is basically timeless. Years and years and years ago, I had a chance to get to know, and I got to work with another author that had Norman Vincent Peale as his immediate teacher when he was a psychologist, and he went on to become a minister. His name was Dr. Robert Schuller.
Oh, yes.
And he passed, I want to think he passed, maybe it was about 12 years ago or whatever. And he used to really talk about the power of positive thinking. You know,
Mhm.
you had, there was great one-liners and
Mhm.
things that Bob Schuller had come up, like inch by inch, everything
Yeah.
is a cinch. If it's going to be, it's up to me.
Remember his hour of power, the
Yeah,
Crystal Cathedral. Oh, yeah.
yeah.
He's a brilliant orator as well.
Yeah, and I remember I had it on my wall in my old office, and Bob Schuller said it best: "When faced with a mountain, I will find a way to either go over it, around it, through it, or underneath it. I will not be stuck on the other side." And I used to apply that to my life, and it's applicable to what we're in right now. That if
Mhm.
it's going to be, it's up to me. We can only push forward. Another thing that Bob had, and I had it on my wall too, right over my computer, is I would rather attempt to do something great and fail at it than do absolutely nothing and succeed at doing nothing. And I believe we are in these times right now. I believe that there are a lot of folks out there that are being called to new positions in society, new leadership roles, government positions, whatever they may be. And I think this is their moment. I believe there's no time like the present. And if it's literally going to be, it's up to me. And I think that's how folks have to look at it, Leighton, that, you can look at what you've had happen over the last 2 years, or you can try to move forward and try to make the next 2 years way better, infinitely way better than the last 2 years were. So, on that note, that's what I would leave folks with, to believe in yourself, believe in your country, believe and choose individuals that you believe are going to represent your best interests and help support them, because this is our country. We should love Canada. We should embrace it. And unfortunately, a lot of folks don't like their own country anymore, don't like what it's become. So it's time to make that change if we think that we can do something about it.
Well, Peter, thank you so much for your time and your knowledge and your faith and for the gift that you've left all of us, and that is your documentary, Lockstep. Folks, it is a must see. It is inspirational. It will change you. I think it's a very, very important work by a very wonderful man, and he's very humble about it, but he's responsible for its production. And we're grateful for it, and especially for him. Thanks so much for being with us today, Peter, on Gray Matter. It's been a real pleasure listening to you.
Thank you for having me, Leighton.